Hello and welcome to this week's webinar, The Business Case for HITRUST I1. Leading it today are Christian White and Gary Holverson, and I'll hand it over to you, Christian.
Great, thanks EJ. Welcome everyone. Like EJ said, I'm Christian White. I lead our services at Risk 360, and with me is Gary Holverson, one of our esteemed HITRUST consultants. We're gonna get right to this. So we're talking HITRUST I1 today. The business case for it. This is kind of our agenda that we're going to follow. We're going to give a brief introduction, then we'll jump into some of the market drivers for HITRUST I1 specifically. We'll talk about the business case and how to build a business case if that's something that you're interested in doing. Gary will talk us through a real-world case study. Then we'll talk about some other matters, present some resources, and then go into Q&A. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, feel free to put it in the chat. And then also there are two handouts that are downloadables for you as well that are within the webinar. All right, Gary, let's get started with the intro to I1.
All right, so the HITRUST implemented one-year assessment, and we'll probably call that the I1 going forward. It's a certifiable assessment. It's governed by the HITRUST Alliance. This assessment is modeled on NIST 853, NIST 800-171, HIPAA, and the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices, or what we'll refer to as HICP, specifically for medium-sized organizations. This is a collaborative effort between the industry, healthcare industry, and the federal government. So the I1 offers a fixed measurement of implementation as opposed to the R2 where you scope it out based on your size and number of records. The HITRUST MyCSF interactive portal for the I1 version 11 was updated in January of 2023. And this requires scoring and evidence for 182 requirement statements. The 182 requirement statements are nested in the full risk-based two-year assessment. The graphic on the right just demonstrates the nesting of requirement statements. And then what this means to you is there's no wasted effort as your organization matures to a larger assessment, say the R2.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Gary, that one of the distinctions with both E1 and I1 are that they're implemented only. So whereas in the R2, you're being assessed against policy, procedures, implemented, potentially measured and managed, it's just implemented for I1. Is that right?
Yeah, it's yes and no. It's focused on the implementation, but sometimes to measure the implementation, the HITRUST requirement statement will instruct you to look at your policy or look at your procedure document and have you executed your control according to how you wrote it. So there are a handful, and I'll call that out as we go through the presentation of how many policies are actually required, where they're not measured, but we measure against them, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So this the I1 can be done as a readiness assessment or a validated assessment. The readiness assessment, when done in a HITRUST MyCSF portal with a HITRUST subscription, leads to a report, whereas the validated assessment conducted by an external assessor can lead to a HITRUST certification. And then the validated assessments must be done by an external assessor, such as Risk 360. The HITRUST I1 certification provides a moderate level of information security assurance to clients, company officers, board members, and investors.
And so we could assume that E1 is probably, baseline information security assurance, and then the R2 would be a much higher level of assurance.
Right, as the graphic Venn diagram there demonstrates. But the good news is all of the requirement statements from an E1 are also included in the I1. All the I1 are also included in the R2. That's as of version 11.
Yeah, that's right.
That could all change in version 12 or going forward. That was not the case for version 9.
Right, yeah. Previous versions didn't have this, and there actually weren't until recently, the E1 and I1 offering. But this year they kind of harmonized everything in a good way with version 11. So definitely happy to see that.
Yeah, so I guess one takeaway is if this is your first shot through HITRUST and you're looking at the I1, go ahead and do the version 11. Don't mess with the version 9, because you'll wind up with an exercise you won't be able to repeat completely as you move up to version 11.
Yeah.
All right. So this chart is to demonstrate where the requirement statements fall. If you can read the 19 domains. So in January of 2023, HITRUST introduced the version 11 of I1, which has the 182 requirement statements. These are grouped across 19, what I like to call responsibility domains. So these are largely a group of similar assets and the responsibility for these assets. Typically, the responsibility domains align with individual policies or a section, a specific section of a larger policy document. They're fairly logical. Organizations distribute the responsibilities differently, but it's a good starting place for identifying subject matter experts to demonstrate implementation of the requirement statements. Now, this is a comparison to a relatively small risk-based 2-year assessment, or an R2. What we did, and I'm comparing this directly to an I1. You can see the distribution of the requirement statements are similar across the responsibility domains. There are more requirement statements in the R2, but the I1 is a great starting point to eventually conduct an R2. You will have done a lot of the work to get there with practice collecting the most important evidence for both assessments. And keep in mind that many of the I1 requirement statements are measured against a policy or a procedure document. In fact, 17 of the 19 responsibility domains in the I1 require policies or process documents for scoring, although there are fewer standards required to be documented.
Yeah, this is a good, I think, visualization of how you might progress. We definitely recommend starting off small. If you don't have to do a full R2 assessment, depending on the risk profile of your organization, you might be able to start with I1 and just do I1 only. There might not be a need to move up to an R2. But like Gary said, I1 is a fixed number of requirement statements, whereas the R2 is dynamic. So what we're showing here is a small type of an R2 assessment, but depending on the risk profile of the organization and the scoping of the assessment, that could easily be 350 plus requirement statements. So I1 is really a good place to begin if you do have an information security program and you're looking to get HITRUST certification. All right, let's dive into some of the market drivers. So, the first one may be the most relevant for HITRUST, just simply because historically HITRUST has been targeted at the healthcare industry. And obviously HIPAA compliance is big in that. And so that's one of the big drivers that we see for why people may want to adopt HITRUST. There's also just good data security and privacy. Sometimes aligning that program to a standard and having a certification is very helpful in communicating value to the marketplace. We see a lot of, I think we saw this really when I1 came out, is whereas the R2 assessments, due to them being so large, it was kind of the larger companies that were doing that and forcing their larger customers to potentially do that. With the I1, since the barriers to HITRUST have been reduced, we see a lot more larger companies using the I1 as a vendor management requirement. So that is another driver that we're seeing. For those that don't necessarily have to do HITRUST but want to be competitive, especially in the healthcare space, having an I1 certification is definitely a reason why you may want to pursue that. as a way to compare with others in the market. HITRUST describes the framework as both a security and risk management framework. So if you're looking for risk management best practices, HITRUST does have a lot of good requirement statements that cover the full scope of risk management from a security perspective. Then industry standards, that's another driver. And then trust and transparency, I'll mention this last one. When companies are wanting to do business with each other, a lot of times you need to, first build that trust, and that can be done through a lot of different mechanisms and over time. But usually to get the ball rolling, you need some sort of NDA, master services agreement, and you need some sort of due diligence package to be completed. And because more and more companies are becoming familiar with HITRUST and relying upon HITRUST certification scheme, that's an easy way to just satisfy the security requirements without having to fill out lengthy questionnaires. So let's jump into the business case here and talk about some of the benefits of HITRUST I1 certification. So we touched on some of these a little bit. It is recognized as an industry standard for third-party information assurance, and HITRUST has been around for a while. Their name is recognized in healthcare, but HITRUST is also trying to be relevant outside of healthcare as well. So we're seeing that, and I think one of the benefits is because the scope of the domains is pretty comprehensive for security. We're seeing that when you have multiple options for information assurance, HITRUST offers a pretty robust one that is both deep and wide versus maybe a SOC 2 or an ISO certification that's not quite as technical when it comes to the requirements. Building customer trust and streamlining due diligence, we talked about that. It really does help to be able to lead with security when having discussions with customers and to say, we take security seriously, here's our HITRUST certification, and be able to have that conversation. That's a great way to establish some trust. Definitely in alignment with best practices. HITRUST is built on a lot of different frameworks that Gary mentioned. I think we have a slide on this coming up, but because a lot of frameworks have been taken into consideration, the I1 requirement statements are pretty comprehensive in terms of best practices. Again, having a good foundation for information security and risk management is important. Demonstrating organizational maturity as well can reduce risk for third parties and customers. And then one thing we've kind of seen lately is, investors and boards of directors really do care about the continuity of the businesses that they invest in or oversee. And to me, getting a certification, aligning with best practices is just part of good governance, part of good business continuity, in a way to, give assurance to those stakeholders that the company is doing the right things to protect its most important data. On this slide, I'll build out and just touch on a few things, but this is kind of just a recap. Some of the business benefits of why you want to potentially get a HITRUST I1 certification is, enabling business, showing a differentiator in the marketplace. We talked a little bit about reducing the burden of security assurance. So Gary, I know you have firsthand experience with this, filling out security surveys that come in all sorts of shapes and sizes from different customers. You could potentially have a whole team dedicated to filling those out, or needing to bother engineering and HR and different business functions to help fill those out. That can be very costly in terms of time and opportunity cost. And we've seen HITRUST certifications be used as a mechanism for not having to fill those out. So that's a big time savings for businesses. Anything else on that, Gary?
Yeah, and once you've filled out the 400, 500 page Excel spreadsheet for one, either client or customer, then all you've got a spreadsheet. You don't have a certification. You don't have something you can leverage going forward. I saw this at one of my hospitals. It took a year to get the the spreadsheet answered to a satisfaction level and then have it approved internally. It took a year just to get the approval for a new piece of software.
Wow. That holds up a lot of value creation. So you're not able to, get the services you need in a timely manner, and those, partners are not able to recognize that revenue either. So this really does kind of streamline that whole cycle. And then having a widely recognized security certification is very meaningful as well. So Gary, this one I'll ask you to run through, if you don't mind. Give us some insight here.
Sure. So for the HITRUST I1 information security best practices, these are standardized and aligned from multiple frameworks. We talked about that before. I'll enumerate those, but primarily your company defines the scope of the assessment. What's the infrastructure? What's the software? Maybe you're building a software. Which people are involved? What processes are involved? And what's the data that you're scoping, that you're putting in scope for this assessment? Then examination reporting. This must be done by an approved HITRUST external assessor, such as Risk 360. The I1 is also an opportunity to demonstrate information security alignment across these multiple frameworks. And like we said before, HITRUST prescribes 182 requirement statements for the I1, and the frameworks that they rely on are NIST 853, NIST 800-171, the HIPAA security rule, and the HICP.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is worth pointing out here is, well, maybe I'll ask you and you can answer it, is how often would you say HITRUST is updating their framework, or at least reevaluating the I1 framework?
Right, good question. So HITRUST in their documentation states that they review the requirement statements and controls on an annual basis, but also as the threat landscape changes. If something new comes out, years ago it was the ransomware, and now business email compromise. As the threat landscape changes, as the threat actors learn a new trick, HITRUST then retools their CSF common security framework to focus on addressing those things. I'm sure they're already talking about AI and where that will fall in.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen, and just being familiar with the framework, is there's controls in there that I just haven't seen across other frameworks or certification schemes. So like when you think of SOC 2, the trust service criteria from the AICPA hasn't been meaningfully updated since 2017. ISO 27001 just went through a new revision for 2022, but that usually gets revised every few years, 3 to 5 years maybe. And so by HITRUST taking that annual approach to at least review it, they're able to respond more in real time with the different threats that are out there. So I've definitely seen some more technical controls that aren't hard to meet, but do address risk, I think, a little bit better than some of the other frameworks.
Yeah, that's true. And while the formal documentation where the different requirement statements will be tied to a specific NIST 853, ISO 27001, 2, and so forth, they may be an older version of that framework, but then HITRUST has the flexibility to say, yeah, it's based on that control statement, but also this. We're gonna add some of the new threats in there to give you something to measure against. Okay, so of course the foundation for a strong information security and risk management program includes implementation of a variety of controls. HITRUST certification demonstrates a well-rounded program that's built on a category of controls, including administrative controls such as governance, policies, and training, also detective controls such as security information and event management systems, however you pronounce that acronym, and threat intelligence managed by the Security Operations Center. Also preventative controls such as firewalls, endpoint protection, encryption and multi-factor authentication, and also corrective controls, such as incident response plans, disaster recovery procedures, and failover processes. Benefits, some of the benefits HITRUST has over other frameworks. Like we said, the framework is updated based on an annual basis, and when there's updates to the current threat landscape.
Great. So for this slide here, we talked a little bit about market drivers. We talked about some of the value props for pursuing HITRUST I1. This particular PowerPoint that we have here is available for download in the webinar. So definitely feel free to download that and take a look. We built this in a way to help people build the business case for I1. So if you're considering HITRUST, but and you might know you need to do it, but you need a way to communicate that to the executive team, this kind of walks you through a basic structure for building that business case. So, a summary slide, some cost benefit analysis, a bunch of different FAQs related to the I1 certification, and then a Gantt chart estimate of, timeline, different stakeholders that you'll want to involve. So it's a good thinking model to use when you're building that business case. And then another download we have is maximizing your ROI using an ROI calculator. And we basically built out a few different scenarios here, whether you're using external consultants to help you build and implement your program, or whether you're doing that in-house and then engaging with the external assessors to just do the assessment piece. This will give you an idea of cost breakdown based on level of effort, and that can be helpful in building and presenting that business case as well. All right, let's jump into that real world scenario, Gary.
Yeah, so this is kind of a hybrid of some of our customers and what we've seen out there in the market. And while it's healthcare based, it could apply to different types of industries. But so this is a healthcare technology company. They're writing software. They have a tentative agreement with a sizable health insurance provider to use their software to serve their customers. However, they're requiring your organization to attain a HITRUST I1 certification within 18 months to maintain the contract. This health insurance company will bring millions in revenue, but it'll also strain your compliance team's resources. The pursuit of the I1 certification will require external expertise, a HITRUST subscription, an external assessor. So it's uncertain if profit from the new client will offset the expense, but a second or third new health insurance client certainly would. So, of course, the ask from leadership is for additional resources to successfully earn the I1 certification. You can't do it by yourself. The expected benefits are meeting the customer regulatory compliance, keeping or earning that customer, enhancing data security and privacy, keeping yourself out of the news, and fostering business reputation and trust, and building a competitive advantage, and streamlining new customer adoption, where you can, more revenue will pay for the added security.
So let's maybe build on this a little bit, or ask some questions around this particular scenario. So, one of the things it mentions at that top paragraph is, they're required to do it within 18 months. And, the question might be, is that feasible? And for most organizations, 12 to 18 months is a good time frame if you already have an information security program. If you're starting from scratch, I'd say 18 to 24 months is probably better. So if you are engaged with clients that are asking you to do this within a certain time frame, just based on the maturity of your organization's program, you might want to try to push that requirement out and kind of let them know that you can report on progress over those 18 to 24 months, but you do need that longer period of time. So definitely something to consider there.
It's the old analogy of building a race car. How fast can you afford to go? If you've got internal skills, where you can drive better or build something in house. Great, you can get that, you can get to compliance levels quicker. If you've got to go outside of your own house to get those skills and tools, you may be purchasing software, you may be adding subscriptions to your operating expenses.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, where we engage with our customers that are pursuing HITRUST I1 certification is kind of in two ways. In the instance where, they don't have the internal resources to build and implement the program, or they need to move fast and they need help doing that, we'll come in as, the consultants, and we'll help stand up the program. There are certain things, obviously, we will need the company's help with, such as actually implementing tools and technology within the company. But as far as, policies, procedures, getting the program off the ground and advising throughout, our team does that. HITRUST also allows a separate team, a distinct team, not the same team, but one of our other teams to do the assessment. So the benefit of having us do both is the same organization, is getting that full picture of the company. And our assessment team is actually then submitting the assessment to HITRUST that does ultimate quality assurance and issues the certification. So the relationship with HITRUST, if you're unfamiliar with it, is a three-part relationship. There's a relationship from the company, with the external assessor, such as us, as well as a relationship with HITRUST, to which, fees are paid for the software and the actual assessment. So it really is, good coordination among the three parties to make this all work. Any other things on this topic, Gary, that you wanted to bring up that might be helpful?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. So as far as next steps, given that prior scenario, I'd start building the business case and start doing the calculation on, the ROI. That'll give some insight into whether, hey, you know what, we think we can do this in-house. We'll implement it in-house, and then we'll just bring the assessor in at the end. Or, hey, we don't have a lot of resources. We can do it ourselves, but it's going to push us toward that 24 months, whereas we could probably get it under 18 if we use an outside party to come in and stand up the program. So those are just kind of some of the different levers to think about as you're making the business case. Few other considerations. So, where would you begin if you're wanting to pursue this? We always recommend starting with a readiness assessment. So that's assessing your organization against the I1 framework, just to get a lay of the land, to know, where you're at. If you have a mature program, chances are you're a good way toward getting that certification. If you don't have a program, it is a pretty heavy lift. So start out with the readiness assessment as a place to get started. That second one, so what if I don't have an internal team? Well, we mentioned that we have our vCISO team that specializes in implementing and managing programs on behalf of our clients. So they might be a good fit if you're looking for that. This next topic is always interesting. So for larger organizations that are subject to multiple different types of security and compliance requirements, they deal with audit fatigue, because in some organizations you feel like you're constantly being audited at all times, which is super frustrating. It's very costly. It burdens the team that's having to respond to requests and manage the overall program, So one of the things that we like to do is implement what's called a single framework strategy, where we'll take a lay of the land of all the compliance requirements that a company is subject to, and we'll do a harmonized approach in our audit to satisfy all those different requirements through a single audit experience. And that's one of the areas that I think kind of distinguish us in our space, but that really does help to reduce costs around audit fatigue. This last one is kind of a segue for our next slide, and I'll let you take the next few slides there, Gary. But pairing I1 with a GRC platform to manage the program. So for every company that is getting a HITRUST certification, whether it's E1, I1, R2, they need to use the MyCSF platform as the assessment mechanism, and that allows the company to input information, to respond to the assessor, to route the assessment object to HITRUST for quality assurance. It kind of facilitates the communication among the three parties. But there are some things that the platform doesn't have, such as evidence request lists, tools to help manage the program itself. So that's where pairing the, your HITRUST efforts with the GRC platform can be very helpful. We have our own GRC platform that we offer to our customers in-house called Phalanx GRC. And Gary, you can walk us through some of the features that you find valuable.
Yeah, the Risk 360 makes centralized evidence requests in a dedicated secure application. So the assessed entity can add users to our tool is called Phalanx. It's a military term. You should probably look it up. It's very interesting, but that is our GRC platform. So rather than email or adding external users to a company's internal file sharing directory, whatever, Box or SharePoint, I've seen permissions to shared drives go wrong too many times. So the assessed entity can assign tasks to team members and subject matter experts within Phalanx. This will streamline the evidence collection and testing. There's an example there of what that would look like. Evidence and artifacts can be mapped to many requirement statements, and then the requirement statements can also be mapped to many evidence artifacts. And like I say, try doing that in a shared spreadsheet. You'll have a mess or crash the spreadsheet, or someone's got the spreadsheet open. I need it. I need to edit it. Can you close it? And then the many-to-many relationship can only be had with a true database environment.
Yeah, and that's where that single framework strategy, I think, is enabled through the platform that, reduces the effort for our clients, also reduces our effort because we can assess a control once across multiple frameworks versus request the evidence 10 times, test it 10 times. So it's definitely very efficient for everyone.
Yeah, I experienced that with a client in a previous life. They ran through one type of assessment, and then like a month later, they started another assessment. And
yeah.
I was managing the process. I said, hey, we're asking the same people for the same stuff. It all could have been done through a single GRC platform. So next we'll talk about the multi-directional collaboration with Phalanx. So real-time metrics are available in the Phalanx GRC dashboards. So there's no more formulas and spreadsheets and last-minute calculations to build the chart before the project meeting. I would literally schedule an hour or more before the meeting to update all the formulas and to put in all the evidence submission. So I didn't get into a meeting and say, oh, I just submitted that evidence to you this morning. Your numbers aren't correct. But as soon as you do it in Phalanx, the dashboard's updated. Nobody has to touch it.
Yeah.
And also the team can comment on the evidence, and this can be integrated with email or Slack. I can comment on the assessed entity, the people I'm working with at the customer. I can comment on their evidence, say, I need this, I need something different. They can send me a question, hey, what do you mean by that? It's all contained within Phalanx. You're not having to go to email. You're not searching through email. All of the comments are attached to the evidence request or to the requirement statement. It's all right there.
Yeah, that's definitely a big time saver.
It's huge.
All right, we've got a few additional resources for everyone. So we have a YouTube playlist specifically for HITRUST. So definitely search that out if you're looking for additional content related to HITRUST. We also have a learning center on our website. We've got a lot of blogs about HITRUST. And if you'd like to speak to us, our website's risk360.com, and there's a big button, speak with an expert, that'll route you to us. And we can, answer any questions that you have. All right, we'll jump into some Q&A here. And, EJ, if there's some questions that have been posed by attendees. Feel free to ask those. Otherwise, Gary and I can come up with questions as well to ask each other.
Okay. Got one here. How much does it typically cost for the HITRUST I1, and what's the runway to reach certification? What kind of time does it take?
Yeah, so there's maybe a few things to consider with that question. Like I mentioned, there's a three-party relationship with HITRUST, the entity being assessed, and then the external assessor. So the entity being assessed will have fees to pay to HITRUST. That's for the MyCSF platform as well as the assessment object. And then there will be fees to pay to the external assessor. And like I mentioned, depending on the assessed entity's maturity and the resources that they have to stand up their program, they might actually engage with that assessed entity for the implementation if that entity has, they may engage with the external assessor to do the implementation as well if that assessor has an implementation team. So what I usually recommend as a ballpark pricing is anywhere from 75 to 100K as a baseline for fees for HITRUST fees and external assessor fees. If you're looking to have the external assessor or another consultancy do the implementation, then it's typically time and materials, and that, depending on how mature the company is, that could easily be another 50 to 100K. So that's kind of what I would give for a ballpark answer. And then as far as timeline, like I said, 12 to 18 months is reasonable for a company with a mature program. Probably 18 to 24 months for a company standing up a program from scratch, unless they are bringing in a third party to help them reduce that timeline. And the reason for that timeline is there's some long poles in the tent that we have in the business case download, such as, for any controls that you implement, they have to be implemented for 90 days before the assessor can assess them. So, if you think about that and think about, well, the assessor needs 90 days to actually do the assessment. All right, well, you're already kind of at 6 months there. And then if you need to actually source tools and technologies and implement controls, then you're looking at an additional time. So those are kind of some of the things that I think about when I think about cost and timeline. Gary, did you have any other comments on that particular question?
No, I think you covered it well, and we talked about it earlier, how fast can you afford to go?
Yeah. What else you got, EJ?
Okay. What other frameworks work well with this level of HITRUST, and do you still have to pay the HITRUST Alliance with this?
So that last part of the question is yes. There are fees that need to be paid to HITRUST for the MyCSF platform and the assessment. As far as what other frameworks work well, just because HITRUST I1 is pretty robust, you almost have 100% coverage on a SOC 2, and you have a lot of coverage on ISO 27001 and some PCI requirements, especially around like organizational type controls. One of the things that we do, since we are a CPA firm as well as an external assessor, is we can issue SOC reports, whereas the certification for HITRUST comes through HITRUST Alliance, and we're actually submitting the assessment that we do. What we do is we'll pair both of those under a single assessment to test all the controls for both HITRUST and SOC 2, and there's almost 100% coverage. So from an assessed entity perspective, it feels like one audit, but there's two different reporting mechanisms that come out of that. One is the SOC 2 report issued by us. The other is the HITRUST certification issued by the HITRUST Alliance. So that's a way to kind of, kill two birds with one stone, I guess. But those frameworks pair very well together.
Okay. And one more is, what should I look for in an external assessor?
I've got some thoughts on that. So maybe I'll give some thoughts, and Gary, whatever else you've got as well. feel free to chime in. The first thing is just good relationship. So these are big investments to either stand up a security program or to get your program certified. And you want to have a good relationship with the assessor. And I think, the foundation of any good relationship is trust. So, being honest with one another, being upfront, working together to create that trust along the way and to have good communication. That's definitely number one in my book. A second one would be, the use of technology. There's a lot of good, platforms out there. So having a technology-enabled service in order to really streamline the audit process and to try to, reduce the amount of burden on your team would be an important thing as well. That's something that we are very committed to. And then the last thing, just a commitment to the customer experience and quality. So quality is kind of you gotta have that as a starting point, but I think even more so than that, it's the customer experience. So that's everything from the communication cadence to weekly status reports to biweekly status calls. Like, you never want to feel like you don't know where you are in the process. So those are some of my thoughts. Gary, do you have other things?
Yeah, by technology, we don't mean a shared spreadsheet and a cloud-hosted box.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Something interactive like a GRC tool, like Phalanx. And I think, Christian, you said it best, is communication. Mm-hmm. Open, honest communication and the frequency and speed of communication.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all the questions we had. Was there anything else you guys wanted to cover?
Maybe just a heads up, in 2 weeks, we'll have another HITRUST webinar. This one will be focused on the E1 offering, which is really the foundational offering that HITRUST has. So if your customers are not requiring a more robust certification, or you just don't have any kind of program, E1 is a good place to start. So we'll be covering that. And I think that's it.
All right. Well, we'll close it with that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Everyone.